Okay, welcome everybody, and this is a session about the structure of the epigraphic text of our EpiDoc training program, for which you can see a link at the bottom of the screen. And this session will be presented by Gabriel Bodard of the Institute of Classical Studies of the University of London. So please, Gabby, go ahead.
Thank you. Yep. So, let me take the URL away so it doesn't cut my stuff. So, yeah, thank you, Irene. So, as Irene says, I'm going to talk about the structure of the epigraphic text. That is to say, when the transcribed text, the epigraphic or papyrological text that you're encoding in EpiDoc, is divided into sections of one kind or another. If you want to get hold of the slides of this presentation, by the way, the URL is here on the first slide there at the beginning. They're freely available. They're Creative Commons licensed, as you can see. So I'm going to talk about three main kinds of structure of an epigraphic text, and three slightly different strategies for how to encode that structure. The first is a very simple structure where you have a text that is in multiple sections that are completely self-contained. This could be, for example, a collection of multiple texts on a single stone, or a manuscript containing several chapters or sections of one kind or another, that you're never going to have any problem with overlapping between those sections or needing to run from one section to another. The second kind is precisely the kind where the section breaks are relatively arbitrary and there is danger of overlap between them. These could be column breaks, page breaks in a longer manuscript, and so forth. And the third kind is where the section breaks that you want to record are, in a sense, completely accidental and have no impact either on the structure of the text itself, nor of the citation scheme that you're using, but you want to record them somehow. This could, for example, include a text written across two blocks, which is nevertheless a single monument, or a broken text where the fragments are separated in some, geographically, and you need to be able to record which part is on which. And so I'll give examples of each of those three as we go forward. Before that, here's the very basic example where you have two texts that are each completely self-contained, as here you're used to encoding an EpiDoc text in a div type edition, and the AB, the anonymous block element, to contain all of the text. Here you simply have another div inside the div type edition, which is a div type text part that also contains the AB and contains all the text in that. So the div type text part nests inside the edition, and you can have as many of those as you need to have your text in there. In this case, for example, you have fragments. The fragments don't overlap. They're not conjoining fragments. They're just separate fragments that we assume to be part of the same text. We have no idea in what order they go, so we simply put them in separate divisions inside the main edition, as shown in this XML fragment on the screen. The more complex case of that is where you have nested subdivisions. You might have a monument that contains two texts, each in one column, and each column contains three sections, perhaps written at different times, but in any case completely self-standing. So you have a text, and this illustration represents the entire monument with the blue square, the columns or individual texts in the green rectangles, and the individual sections of those texts with the red rectangles. In this case, just as we can nest it in our conceptual image of the monument, we can nest the three parts in the XML. So we have the div type edition represents the entire monument, the entire text that we're considering a single text for the purposes of our EpiDoc edition. You have the text part subtype column for purposes of those columns. They might be separate columns or separate texts. And then you have a div text part subtype section for the sections within those. Again, these are all freestanding texts. They all nest perfectly inside one another, and can be represented unproblematically with these non-overlapping nested elements in XML as we're used to doing. Note that in this example, the div type text part is a required type. It's a required attribute. The subtype attribute is optional, and the value of it is also completely free. There are only, as you will be aware, 6 values that you can use for div type, but there's no restriction whatsoever on the values you can put in subtype. You put in whatever's useful for you in recording your edition, or you can leave subtype blank if you don't want to distinguish between different kinds of text parts in your edition. So far we've had all the fairly simple example. Here we have an example which is slightly more complex, although still fairly unproblematic in terms of nesting, where we have, again, we originally had a single block of stone represented by the blue square, which was originally divided into 3, or was originally had 3 texts inscribed on it, the green columns there represented by A, B, and C. But of this block of stone, this monument, only 3 fragments survive. These are represented by the red rectangles numbered 1, 2, and 3. And we want to record those columns, those original 3 texts, and the fragments within them. So having made that decision, and this is a decision that as an epigrapher or as a papyrologist, you will make that decision when you're making your paper edition, right? When you're doing this, by hand in your original notes, you'll decide how you want to divide up your text. And once you've decided that this is how you want to divide up your text, again, you can simply use the nested elements. You have the text part subtype fragments inside the subtype columns. And in one case, you have the same fragment appearing, or in 2 cases, in fact, you have the same fragment. Fragment 1 appears both inside column A and inside column B. And it's only the number that you've given here, the n attribute that you've given those fragments, that tells you, the editor, and that tells the reader when it's printed on the screen, that these are bits of text that appear in the same fragment. Okay? Just as if you were printing it this way in a printed text, they would have to use the numbers printed above each text to understand how the sections are divided. We could have exactly the same scenario where we have a single block of stone with originally 3 texts on it, that of now only 3 fragments survive that are overlapping. However, because of the nature of the fragments, or because of our understanding of the text, we've decided as an editor, and again, you would make this decision if you were publishing on paper as well, we've decided that it's the fragments we want to edit, and that some of these fragments have multiple columns in them. And that's simply a decision we'd make. And once we've decided to do that, we simply reverse the nesting in the XML. So the XML simply reflects the decision you've made about how to encode your texts. You've got fragments 1, 2, and 3 here, and inside fragment 1, it has 2 columns, A and B. Fragment 2 has a single column, A, which, again, only the number tells us that that's the same column as column A in fragment 1, just as it would on paper. So those are just 3 examples of slightly different levels of complexity of how you would encode completely freestanding sections of text within a single larger edition. Probably a slightly more common scenario, however, is where you have a text that is in multiple columns, but those columns are arbitrary breaks within the text, and you don't, it would be slightly awkward to divide that text into multiple completely contained divisions, because there may be other features that would overlap across those columns. In that case, as with a monumental inscription such as this one, we might simply use an empty element. You see here in the middle, the empty element CB, to indicate where that column break happens. This has the advantage, of course, that it doesn't have to break the flow of the text. It enables other XML structures to overlap with that column break. And it can, of course, have citation information attached to it, just as anything else can. This is exactly the same principle as the line beginning tag, right? The LB tag that you're used to seeing at the beginning of every line. You can also attach a CB tag at the beginning of every column so that it doesn't have to break any structure that goes on there. This column break can then take place within a document, within a single AB element. You can have columns that begin in one AB and end in another one. You can have a column that begins in the middle of one chapter of a text and ends in another. You can have a column that appears, column beginning that appears mid-sentence if you're interested in encoding the semantic structure in any way. Or, as in this case, it can appear in the middle of a name. If we had divided this into two individual divisions, we couldn't encode Nero P. Quintilius as a single person name, because we would have had those overlapping XML tags, which would have caused a problem for us. And column beginnings can even appear occasionally within a single word, right? And if you're tagging words for indexing and so forth, that will be a real problem both. And even if you're not tagging the words, it'd be a real problem for extracting that word and for letting the machine realize that it is in fact the same word, which is complicated enough if you have an LB in the middle of a word, but it'd be very difficult if it was in a whole different division. So this is perhaps, it's simpler to explain, so I've talked about it less, but this is perhaps more common even than the completely self-contained text fragments and divisions that I talked about in the first part of this presentation. The third example is where the breaks in the text are not only arbitrary and not only potentially overlapping parts of the text, but they're also not something that are part of the citation scheme. So for the example here, I'm going to take this completely fictional inscription. The text must come from a real inscription. At some point I copied and pasted it, but the inscription that I'm describing is fictional. This is a text which was originally inscribed on a monument that was made up of 6 blocks of stone. These blocks of stone were obviously stuck together. They were probably plastered over, so you couldn't tell it was 6 blocks of stone when it was originally inscribed. It was inscribed on these 6 blocks of stone, and the stonecutter paid no attention to where one block began and one block ended when choosing what word to put where, or even what letter to put where. Some letters are divided across the 2 blocks. In the ancient world, that was not a problem. That was a single monument. That was a single text. If we were recording it in that state, we would not indicate any text parts whatsoever. However, in the 2,000 years since that text was inscribed, this monument has fallen over. The top 3 stones all collapsed onto the ground. One of them is still face down in the ground and very difficult to read. One of the lower 3 stones was taken away to be reused in building somewhere and has never been recovered. And one of the stones is such an attractive stone, still has some of its monumental engraving around it, and the letters are very, very sharp, and so has been taken away to the British Museum in the 19th century. If you wanted to read this inscription now, obviously it would be almost impossible because they'd be in different places. So it is still a single text, and we want to treat it as a single text. We want to be able to read the word synkletos without it being divided into multiple parts. But it is important for an epigraphist who wants to look at this text to know where they can find the stone that that phi on line 2 appears on. Do they have to go to Turkey to look at the inscription, or do they have to go to the British Museum, or do they just have to trust the 19th century transcription that because the original is lost? Okay, so they want to know how the text is divided. So I would simply do something like this. I would say, rather than calling these columns, because they're not columns, the text was never written in 3 columns, the text was written in a single column, I would say we have a single division, we have a single AB anonymous block of text, and on line 1, we mark using this milestone element, which is again another empty element. And you remember we use empty elements largely because we want to indicate a point at which something happens or at which something begins, without wrapping it in anything. And we simply say this milestone marks where a block begins, and it's block number 1 begins here. Block number 1 begins here, and we have these letters on. Block number 2 begins in the middle of that word synkletos, and block number 3 appears in the middle of the word demos. On line 2, block 1 begins at the beginning, block 2 begins again in between two words, block 3 begins again in the middle of a word. And we could continue for all of the lines. I've only given the first 2 lines for this example, primarily because it's, as I said, a fictional example. This enables us to print the text, for example, still as a running continuous text, but with, if you look closely in the middle of the word synkletos, we've printed the vertical line to show where the block break is. This is if you think your reader will be interested in that information, you can give them that information by putting the block mark in there. And you can even attach numbers to those if you think that's really important. If this is, a text where the various blocks are in completely different places, and you want to be able to people to go and find them and figure out where they are. And these are just display decisions that you can make. I think if you were to encode it this way, as I showed 2 slides ago, and run it through FS as part of your exercise, you probably wouldn't get either of these displays. But these would be very easy to customize if you wanted to do so for your edition. I'll just summarize the points there. That the main distinction that you want to make when you're deciding how to break your text into text parts is are the sections of the text completely freestanding and in no danger of having overlapping constructs, in which case you can use a div type equals text part for them, especially if you want to consider them as separate texts in some sense. In that case, you use div type equals text part. You can, if you want, use a subtype element whose value is unconstrained. You can use any value in there you like. Worth noting that the text parts may nest in each other, as you've seen, but they must tessellate. If part of a text is broken up into text parts, the whole text must be broken up into text parts. Okay, you can't have a div type addition with a fragment and then some text that is not in a fragment. That's not, it's either all fragments or it's none of it's in fragments. And individual text parts may, in this case, need to be divided up between their parents' parts because they can't overlap. You can't have a fragment overlapping with a column. If that's the case, you have to decide that the fragment has 2 columns in it and the second fragment has 2 columns in it. The second example that I gave is where you don't want to break up your texts, but you want to indicate where the break between these parts or sections of the text occur. In that case, you can use elements such as CB for column break, PB for page break, and there's a few other B break empty elements. Or if there isn't already an element in TI for the kind of break you're talking about, such as the block break that we used in our example, you can use the element milestone, which is the generic version of line break, column break, page break, etc. And you simply give it a unit to say what kind of break you're talking about. This is an empty element, so it doesn't cause any problems with overlapping, and it doesn't need to be part of the citation structure of your edition. That's about all I wanted to say about that. Irene, was there anything you wanted to add or clarify from any of that?
No, I think it's very clear.
Okay, great. Thank you very much then.
Sure.
Cheers.
Thank you, and see you at next